Before this story begins, promise me one thing. If you believe kindness still matters, if you believe a single brave child can shake an entire town, hit subscribe right now, because stories like this don't survive without people like you. On the coldest night of the year, a little girl opened her door to save two freezing dogs. She thought she was doing the right thing. She thought no one would ever know. But the next morning, police cars surrounded her house. Neighbors were forced back, sirens screamed, and what officers found inside would change lives forever. This isn't just a story about dogs. It's about secrets buried for years. A child braver than any adult. And a truth so dangerous, it took an entire police department to contain it. Stay with me, because what happens next, no one saw coming. The snow didn't fall gently that night. It attacked the ground like shattered glass, driven sideways by a wind that howled through the narrow streets of Briar Hollow as if the town itself were being hunted, and inside a small blue house at the end of Willow Lane, 8-year-old Emily Carter sat curled on the living room floor, hugging her knees, listening to the old heater click and fail again, her breath fogging the air as she stared at the front door, because even though her mother had been gone for hours working the late shift at the nursing home and her father had disappeared from their lives long before Emily could remember his face, she had learned something very important in her short life. The night always spoke first, and if you listened closely enough, it told you who needed help. The walls creaked under the pressure of the storm, the windows rattled like teeth, and just as Emily was about to pull her threadbare blanket tighter around her shoulders, she heard it. A sound so small it almost blended with the wind, but not quite, a whimper, thin and desperate, cutting through the storm like a blade, followed by another, deeper, rasping cry, right outside her door. Emily froze. The rules echoed in her head, rules her mother repeated every night before leaving for work. Don't open the door. Don't answer anyone. If something happens, call 911. Emily knew the rules, but she also knew that sound, because she'd heard it once before when she found an injured bird behind the school dumpster and stayed with it until a teacher came. This sound was fear, this sound was pain, and it was coming from something alive. She stood on shaky legs, padding barefoot across the icy floor, peeking through the narrow window beside the door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the storm could hear it, and what she saw made her breath catch. Two dogs, barely more than shadows against the snow, huddled together on her porch, their fur stiff with ice, their bodies trembling so violently it looked like they might shatter, one larger, dark-coated dog shielding a smaller tan one, its ribs visible, its eyes glassy but locked onto the door as if it knew this was the last place left to try. Emily didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She turned the knob with numb fingers and pulled the door open, the cold rushing in like a living thing, and the dogs didn't bark or move aggressively or hesitate either. They collapsed forward, crossing the threshold as if the house itself had reached out and pulled them to safety. The door slammed shut behind them, and Emily fell to her knees beside the dogs, wrapping her arms around their shaking bodies, whispering, "It's okay, you're safe, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true, because the larger dog had something around its neck. Not a collar, not exactly, but a thick leather strap with a metal clasp, scratched and dented, stamped with faded letters Emily couldn't read, and when she touched it, the dog flinched, not in pain, but in memory, the kind of flinch that comes from hands that aren't gentle. She dragged old towels from the bathroom, rubbed their paws until feeling returned, poured warm water into a bowl, then another, breaking slices of bread and soaking them slowly, patiently, the way her mom taught her, and as the dogs drank and ate, their breathing steadied, but their eyes never left her face, as if they understood something important, that this small human had chosen them when the world had not. Emily made a bed for them beside the couch, curling up nearby despite the cold, and somewhere between the wind screaming outside and the heater finally groaning back to life, she fell asleep with her hand resting on the larger dog's shoulder, unaware that this single act of kindness had already set things into motion far beyond her understanding, because across town, in a dark office filled with flickering monitors, a silent alarm had just triggered, one that hadn't been activated in over 7 years. The morning came too quietly. No birds, no passing cars, just a heavy stillness pressing against the house, and Emily woke to the sound of engines idling outside, low and constant, vibrating through the floor, and when she sat up, rubbing her eyes, the dogs were alert now, standing, tense, ears back, the larger one positioning itself between Emily and the door, a low warning rumble in its chest, and before Emily could even stand, a sharp knock cracked through the air, followed by a voice amplified through a loudspeaker, calm but commanding, "This is the Briar Hollow Police Department. Whoever is inside the residence, please come to the door immediately." Emily's stomach dropped. She peeked through the curtain, her breath hitching, and her heart nearly stopped, because the street was full. police cars everywhere, lights flashing silently, officers spread out behind doors and fences, one armored vehicle parked near the corner like something out of a movie, neighbors standing in their pajamas behind police tape, whispering, pointing, fear spreading faster than the cold ever had, and Emily didn't know what she'd done wrong, only that the dogs behind her were shaking again, not from cold this time, but from recognition. The knock came again, harder. "We know someone is inside," the voice said. "Please open the door." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the handle, tears burning her eyes, and just before she turned it, the larger dog pressed its head gently against her side, as if asking permission, as if promising something, and when the door finally opened, the officers froze, not because of Emily, not because of the dogs, but because one of them, a gray-haired sergeant with tired eyes, stared at the strap around the dog's neck and whispered a single word under his breath that no one else heard. "Impossible." Behind him, radios crackled to life, codes spilling out in urgent bursts, and somewhere in the crowd, Emily's mother screamed her daughter's name as officers moved in, not with weapons raised, but with a kind of awe mixed with dread, because they weren't surrounding a house anymore. They were containing a secret that was never meant to resurface. And Emily, still clutching the dog's fur, had no idea that by opening her door the night before, she had just reopened a case that once destroyed careers, shattered families, and buried the truth under years of silence. The storm outside had passed. But something far worse had just begun. The police did not rush the house the way Emily had seen on television, with shouting and guns and chaos. Instead, they moved with a strange, almost reverent caution, as if the small blue house on Willow Lane had suddenly become something fragile, something dangerous not because of what was inside, but because of what it represented, and Sergeant Daniel Mercer, the gray-haired officer who had whispered, "Impossible," stepped forward slowly, raising one hand to stop the others, his eyes never leaving the thick leather strap around the larger dog's neck, because he had seen that strap before, not once but dozens of times, burned into his memory from photographs sealed in evidence boxes marked classified, photos that were never supposed to leave the archive room beneath the old courthouse, photos tied to a case so toxic it had nearly ended his career and sent two good officers into early retirement. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, barefoot on the cold floor, her small fingers buried in the dog's fur, her face pale and streaked with tears, and all she could think was that she had done something terribly wrong, that kindness had somehow become a crime, and when Mercer finally spoke, his voice was softer than she expected, almost gentle. "Sweetheart," he said, crouching to her level, "what's your name?" "Emily," she whispered. They were cold. Behind Mercer, officers murmured into radios, repeating phrases that made no sense to anyone listening. "Confirm visual, notify the unit, code Black 7, and the larger dog let out a low growl, not threatening, but protective, shifting closer to Emily, while the smaller dog pressed against her leg, trembling. Mercer noticed everything. The way the dogs positioned themselves, the way they watched hands instead of faces, the way their bodies stayed coiled, ready, like trained animals waiting for commands that never came. "You didn't do anything wrong," Mercer said, though his heart hammered as if he were lying. "Can you tell me where you found them?" "On the porch," Emily said. "They were crying. I didn't want them to die." Mercer closed his eyes for a moment. 7 years ago, on a freezing night much like this one, two dogs exactly like these, same size, same markings, same behavior, had vanished from a high-security research facility outside Briar Hollow, a place officially described as a behavioral study center, and unofficially known among officers as the Kennel, a place surrounded by fences, cameras, and secrets, a place tied to a government-funded program that was quietly shut down after something went terribly wrong. The official report said the dogs were euthanized during an evacuation. The unofficial truth was far darker. And now, impossibly, here they were, alive, older, scarred, wearing a strap that should have been destroyed. "Sergeant," one of the younger officers hissed from behind, eyes wide. "Her mother's here." Mercer turned just as a woman in a nursing uniform broke through the crowd, her face white with terror, shouting Emily's name, fighting against an officer's grip until Mercer waved him off. "Mom," Emily cried, running forward, and for a moment, the world shrank back to something normal as her mother, Laura Carter, dropped to her knees and wrapped her daughter in her arms, sobbing, demanding answers, demanding to know why the police were at her house, demanding to know if her child was under arrest, and Mercer stood there, struggling to find words that would not shatter her. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "we need to ask you some questions." "About the dogs." Laura stiffened, pulling Emily closer. "They're just dogs," she said. "My daughter saved them." "I know," Mercer replied. "But these dogs may be connected to an ongoing investigation." The words sounded absurd even to him, but the moment they left his mouth, Laura's face changed, not with confusion, but with something else, something like recognition mixed with fear, and Mercer saw it, the flicker of a reaction that told him this was no longer just coincidence. The house was cleared. Slowly, officers stepping inside not to search for weapons, but to document, photograph, record every detail, while animal control was called off at Mercer's direct order, replaced instead by a black, unmarked SUV that arrived without sirens, its windows tinted so dark they reflected nothing. Neighbors whispered theories. Drug bust, hostage situation, illegal fighting dogs, but none of them were close to the truth, because the truth was locked behind clearance levels and non-disclosure agreements and the kind of power that erased people who talked too much. Emily sat on the couch between her mother and Mercer, clutching a mug of cocoa someone had made for her, listening as adults spoke in careful half-sentences, while the dogs lay at her feet, alert but calm, as if they knew this was not yet the end. When the man from the SUV finally entered, everything shifted. He was tall, sharply dressed, too polished for a small-town emergency, and when Mercer saw him, his jaw tightened. "You shouldn't be here," Mercer said quietly. "I got the same alert you did," the man replied. "And unlike you, I still answer to it." He looked down at the dogs, his expression unreadable. "They survived longer than expected." Laura Carter's breath caught. "Expected," she said. "What are you talking about?" The man finally looked at her, really looked, and something like surprise crossed his face. "You don't know," he said. Then this just became much more complicated. Mercer felt anger rise in his chest. "You said they were terminated," he snapped. "You signed the report." "The report was a lie," the man said calmly. "A necessary one." Emily looked between them, her voice small but steady. "They're good," she said. "They didn't hurt anyone." The man crouched in front of her, studying her the way one might study a phenomenon. "No," he said softly. "They wouldn't. Not unless they were told to." Mercer's hand clenched into a fist. The truth, when it began to spill, did not come all at once. It leaked out slowly, in fragments, in guarded admissions and interrupted arguments, until Laura's knees gave out and she had to sit down, because the dogs Emily had saved were not strays, not abandoned pets, but survivors of Project Winterhold, a covert program designed to train animals for search, surveillance, and, when necessary, lethal response, animals conditioned to obey complex commands, to recognize targets, to endure pain without breaking, and when public scrutiny threatened exposure, the project was shut down overnight, its assets disposed of, its failures buried. Except someone had helped these two escape. Laura stared at the dogs, tears streaming down her face. "Oh God," she whispered. "It's you." Mercer's head snapped toward her. "You've seen them before," he said. Laura nodded, shaking. "Years ago," she said. "I cleaned the facility. Night shifts. I wasn't supposed to look at anything. But I did." Her voice broke. "They were just puppies. They cried all the time." The room went silent. The man from the SUV looked furious. "You violated protocol," he said. Laura met his gaze with sudden defiance. "I gave them water," she said. "I talked to them. And one night a door was unlocked." Mercer understood then. Not a breach. Not an accident. An act of mercy. Emily stared at her mother, realization dawning. "You saved them," she whispered. Laura pulled her close. "I tried," she said. "I thought they were gone." The man straightened, his voice cold. "This conversation is classified," he said. "These animals are government property." The larger dog stood, placing itself between him and Emily, eyes locked, muscles tense, and for the first time, Mercer saw fear flicker across the man's face, because the dog was not waiting for a command. It was choosing. Outside, more vehicles arrived, federal this time, and Mercer knew the clock was running out, that whatever happened next would define not just his career, but Emily's life, because kindness had collided with power, and power rarely forgave. Emily tightened her grip on the dog's fur, her small heart pounding, and made a decision that would shock everyone in that room, because she looked up at Mercer and said, clearly, bravely, "You can't take them. They're my family now." And for the first time since the alarm had triggered, Mercer wondered if the system that trained those dogs had finally met something it couldn't control. By the time the sun rose fully over Briar Hollow, the quiet street on Willow Lane had become a sealed perimeter, not because anyone inside the small blue house was dangerous, but because too many people in high places had suddenly realized that a mistake they buried years ago had grown teeth and a conscience, and Sergeant Daniel Mercer stood in the front yard with his coat pulled tight, watching black vehicles line the curb, their engines humming like patient predators, while inside the house, 8-year-old Emily Carter sat cross-legged on the living room floor, one hand resting on each dog, feeling their warmth, their steady breathing, and knowing with a clarity that surprised even her that whatever these adults were afraid of, it was not the dogs, it was the truth. The federal officials did not introduce themselves by name. They rarely did. They spoke in clipped tones, referencing statutes and recovery orders, talking about assets, and containment, and liability, and every word pushed Laura Carter closer to panic, because she had spent her life on the edges of systems like this, cleaning their floors, emptying their trash, staying invisible, and she knew how easily people like her were erased when they became inconvenient. "They're not things," she kept saying, her voice shaking. "They're alive. So were the subjects in the human trials," one of the men replied without looking at her, and Mercer felt something inside him harden into resolve. The dogs sensed the shift long before the humans did. The larger one, Mercer remembered the designation from the old files, K-17, moved deliberately, placing its body between Emily and the officials, its posture calm but immovable, while the smaller one, K-22, stayed close to Laura, pressing its head against her leg as if remembering the woman who had whispered to it in the dark years ago. When one official stepped forward too quickly, K-17 growled, not loud, not wild, but precise, and the room stopped breathing, because that sound was not the voice of an animal acting on fear, it was the voice of training restrained by choice. "This is exactly why they must be removed," one official said. "They're unpredictable." Mercer turned on him. "No," he said, "they're predictable. They're protecting a child." The man scoffed. "Sentiment isn't override national security." Emily looked up then, her eyes bright with tears but steady, and said the words that would later be replayed on news channels across the country, "If they were so dangerous, why am I still alive?" Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Someone cleared their throat. Another checked a tablet. The truth was inconvenient. These dogs had every opportunity to act violently, and they hadn't. They had chosen gentleness in a world that trained them for brutality. Mercer knew what that meant. It meant the program had failed, not because the dogs were flawed, but because they weren't. What happened next unfolded faster than anyone expected. A neighbor, one of the same people who had been whispering behind police tape, began recording on her phone, streaming live, her shaky narration capturing Emily's small voice, Laura's tear-streaked face, the dog's quiet vigilance, and when one official tried to stop her, Mercer stepped in front of the camera and said, "Let it run." By noon, clips were everywhere. Little girl saves freezing dogs. Police surround house. Government wants them back. The story spread across the US and UK like wildfire, because it struck something raw and universal, the idea that innocence had stumbled into something cruel and refused to step aside. Pressure mounted quickly. Calls came in from City Hall, from the state, from offices Mercer had never spoken to before, and each call asked the same question in different ways. Can this be contained? And for the first time, the answer was no. Project Winterhold, once a classified footnote, was being dragged into the light, its documents leaked by someone with a conscience and a secure connection, its methods dissected by experts who recoiled at what they read, and suddenly the dogs were no longer assets, they were evidence. Laura was offered a deal that afternoon. Quiet relocation, a financial settlement, non-disclosure agreements thick as phone books. "Your daughter can have a good life," a man said gently. "Somewhere else." Laura looked at Emily, then at the dogs, and shook her head. "She already does," she said. Emily squeezed her hand. Mercer watched, pride and fear twisting together in his chest, because he knew what refusing meant. It meant standing alone, but they weren't alone for long. Veterinarians volunteered their services. Lawyers offered representation pro bono. Former employees of the kennel came forward with stories they'd been too afraid to tell. One by one, the wall of silence cracked, and through it poured years of guilt and regret, until the narrative changed completely, not reckless child endangers town, but child exposes hidden cruelty. When the injunction finally came down, it was almost anticlimactic. The dogs would remain with the Carters under protective custody, the program would be formally investigated, and no further attempts at retrieval would be made without court approval. The moment the officials left, the house felt lighter. Emily laughed for the first time since the storm, burying her face in K-17's fur, while Laura sank onto the couch, exhausted but unbroken. Mercer lingered at the door, his job technically done, but his heart unwilling to leave. "You were very brave," he told Emily. She shook her head. "I was just cold," she said. So were they. Months later, Briar Hollow would add a new story to its identity. Not about secrets or fear, but about a little girl who opened her door. The dogs would get names, Shadow and Ash, and spend their days learning how to be ordinary, something they had never been allowed to be before. Project Winterhold would be shut down permanently, its architects facing consequences they never thought would come. And Emily would grow up knowing that kindness is not small, that mercy can be louder than sirens, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is open a door when the world tells you to keep it closed. And if you're still here, still listening, still believing that stories like this matter, subscribe now. Because the world needs more reminders that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes, it wears pajamas, and saves two freezing dogs on a winter night.